Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's Gas Resource Management Working Group. Today is our third working group for this effort. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference portion of today's meeting. And then I'm also joined on the line by Mark Richardson, our working group facilitator. Before we get started, just want to make you all aware that the presentation that we'll be discussing today, along with the revised discussion paper, are available out on the Gas Resource Management webpage. And you can get to that page by going to kaiso.com. And then you'll see the Stay Informed tab on the main landing page on kaiso.com. If you click that and go to Policy Initiatives, that'll take you out to our Policy Initiative landing page. And then you'll be able to either search for gas resource management or just scroll down on the page. And then these documents will be one of the very first activities posted there on that page. Today's call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only, so any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. These working groups are intended to stimulate open dialogue and engage different perspectives, so we do want to hear from you all, but just a reminder to please keep those comments professional and respectful. We will be stopping throughout the call today for questions and comments. So if you connected to audio through the WebEx, you'll want to use the call or use the call me option. You'll want to raise your hand by selecting the raise hand icon, which is located actually at the bottom of your screen. And then if you connected to audio outside of the WebEx, you'll want to press #2, and that will enter you into the phone only queue. So we'll be keeping an eye on both the hands and the phone only queue today as we go through the meeting. And then just a reminder for everyone to please state your name and affiliation before making your comment so we know who the comment or question is coming from. And then Adrian is our event producer today, so if you need technical assistance at any point, you can send a chat to him. And then you can also send your question or comment via the chat to me directly. Again, my name is Isabella Nicosia, or you can send it to all panelists, and we'll keep an eye on that as we move along today as well. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Mark and we'll get things started.
Thank you, Isabella. Can you confirm you hear me okay?
Yep, sounds good.
All right, fantastic. Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday. I think this is a good way to kick off the Monday. I really appreciate everyone's engagement on this particular topic as we continue to walk through some of these challenges. We've been receiving some good feedback, so that's exciting news, and I really hope today to kind of dive into a little bit more detail around some of those nuances and issues that you're facing today in the context of gas resource management and really kind of take that next step. So just a quick reminder for the goals of this working group. We really want to try to continue to frame and solidify those problem statements, and through today's discussion, we're looking to kind of identify what those root causes are around those problem statements, and then we're also going to be kind of taking a temperature check as to what we've heard. Always keep in mind some of those principles that we've landed on around transparency, simplicity, efficiency, and feasibility. I think that will be great as we continue today's conversation. One thing I wanted to note, just be aware and cognizant that there's many organizations on the line, some from the trading house, some from the marketing side, some from the BA side. So let's do our best to respect those boundaries and maintain the appropriate level of conversation and not share some of that data sensitivity related price information and things like that as it pertains to the gas market. So let's move to the next slide, please, Isabella. All right. So we did only hear from one stakeholder on comments. I'd like to thank that organization for providing actual comments on the discussion paper #2. I know there's a few organizations that reached out to me individually letting us know that they would be submitting some comments late. So it is not too late to do that. We can absolutely incorporate those comments into the discussion 3 discussion paper that we're going to be posting after today's conversation and kind of incorporate that into the next meeting. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that a little bit later. So at a very high level, kind of what we heard from stakeholder comments are accounting for OFOs and entitlements on various pipelines. So I'd definitely like to dig in a little deeper on that. A continued theme is real-time market volatility. What exactly does that mean? There's a slide that's going to allow for that conversation a little bit later. And then illiquidity in the evening nomination cycle for the gas market was another topic that we've continued to hear over the course of these working group sessions. Let's go to the next slide so I can kind of tee up. All right, so here's where I'm hoping we kind of have the meat of our conversation today on these next 3 slides. And apologies for posting that late. I do take responsibility for that. There was quite a bit of changes and really challenged myself into kind of how to frame up these particular topics to allow for that robust discussion. So apologies. The presentation should be posted out on the web page that Isabella mentioned earlier. I just wanted to own that. It's no one else at the ISO, it's me, so apologies there. So cataloging known issues to date based on that stakeholder feedback. So we've heard a need for a matrix, and what I mean by matrix is the matrix would have a column that kind of presents some of the challenges that we've heard to date, a column that represents the associated functionality that is in place today for that particular challenge, another column that may demonstrate the reasoning behind that functionality or the why it is the way it is today, and then lastly, stakeholder feedback as it pertains to each one of those challenges, and then even potentially, and what we're going to dive in today, I don't want to call it a solution, but a potential solution around each one of those challenges to kind of better help that gas resource management. We also have Katie Wickler with us today. She's going to be diving into from an educational side to kind of help level set and educate the entire community on some of that existing functionality today after we get through these next slides. So let's kind of dive in there. All right. Challenges expressed to date. Number 1, insufficient information for procurement stemming from gas and energy market timeline adjustments. So in red, what I have represented here is kind of that quote unquote issue I've heard. And then in green, what we try to represent here is some of the things we've heard around potentially resolving that issue. So participants do not have certainty in day-ahead advisory awards and forecasts to utilize as procurement targets, and therefore do not have sufficient information to participate timely in that day-ahead nomination cycle. So I'm trying to, and what we've heard was the first thing here is a new 5 a.m. advisory run. Right. So what I'm looking from the community, and I'd really encourage you to raise your hand and kind of chime in here, is help me understand why 5 a.m. is a better time to have a new advisory run, and how that would be better in informing your gas traders getting ready to make that nomination for the next day. And I believe that nomination, if I recall from last conversations, that nomination has taken place right around that 8 a.m. time frame. So can anybody weigh in as to the idea behind that 5 a.m. advisory run and why that would be more beneficial than how it is today with the day-ahead advisory run? I see Michelle from LA with her hand up. Thank you, Michelle, for being the first one willing to jump in here. Go for it. Adrian, can we unmute Michelle's line?
Yes, sir. Stand by there.
You there, Michelle?
Nope, hold on one second. It's not doing it.
Maybe while we're working out Michelle's audio issue, maybe we can go to Joe.
Yeah, let's go to Joe. Let's unmute Joe.
Michelle raised her hand, but I'll try to find her again.
Can you hear me?
Hey, Joe, go for it. And I believe you're with SRP, is that correct?
I can provide a quick and succinct response to that. There is a difference between when the market trades the actual commodity and when the scheduling window with the pipeline to schedule the commodity that you bought or sold takes place. So yes, and again, I'm speaking to essentially El Paso Transwestern in the Southwest. Yes, the scheduling window goes much later than 5. I believe it closes around 10:30. However, the market actually trades in the summer when we're on our time doesn't switch, so we're basically the same as the West Coast. Trades essentially between 4:30 and 5:30 is when about 90% of the volume will trade. You'll get a few little trades trickling into about 6 a.m. And then from that point on for the next 4 hours is when scheduling takes place. So I know we've been using, I think, the nomination cycle as a proxy for both of those events, both the actual trading in the market and the scheduling, but they're actually different with different timelines. And to go all the way back to your question of why 5 a.m., it sits in the middle of when the commodity actually trades. If you'd like to bump it up to 4 a.m., that's even better. But 5 was probably about as late as we could go when we still have a reasonable chance of enough volume being out there, liquidity, to procure the necessary gas to match up with the advisory award. So hopefully
I appreciate
that helped a little bit to answer your question.
No, it totally did. Thank you, Joe. And I would like to hear from others if 4 a.m. sounds better as well. So let's try Michelle again.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, cool. I'll add to Joe. There is a difference between the procurement of it and the scheduling aspect of it. And one of the biggest things that 5 a.m. makes sense is because before the market actually starts trading heavily is not only the liquidity, but how you're able to procure the gas. And I'll speak on behalf of how LA does the day ahead purchasing. A lot of it, we want to go ahead and capture the day ahead, and the GDA would consider the gas daily index pricing before suppliers start trading in fixed price. So for us, even for right now, the way that we do things, we get a rerun from our current planners, and that triggers what volumes we're going to be procuring on this day ahead market. So the procurement really happens between like the 5 to 6 a.m. window.
Mm-hmm.
After that, the marketers end up wanting to buy fixed price.
Got it. Now, Michelle, I hear you say 5 a.m. and just to kind of level set with everyone, we're talking about PPT, right? Would 4 a.m. also be beneficial, or do you see an issue potentially with 4 a.m.?
No, I actually think 4 a.m. would be beneficial because often we start during like really critical and high demand. We see that fixed price market starts around 5:30, so trades are already starting at 4 a.m.
Got it. Now, and I appreciate you weighing in there, Michelle, and this isn't necessarily a question directly to you. It's again, to the audience. And maybe before I do that, let me go to Stuart first. So Stuart Kelly with LA.
Sure, I'm trying to. So the advisory run in my mind was always a run. It wasn't a full market run, it was an RSC run. So you're talking about doing a full market run at 5 a.m. in number one, is that correct?
Yeah, I think through discussions, it was a run that would kind of produce schedules that are, air quote, more accurate, right? It's as good as data in versus data out. And based on those potential schedules, participants would utilize those schedules in determining how much volume they would likely want to procure in that day ahead nomination cycle.
Yeah, makes sense, but there'd probably be an advisory run and then take those inputs for a full market run, right? Because they're going to be slightly different, I think.
Can you weigh in a little bit more there? What do you mean by slightly different?
Yeah,
like, are you saying that like? Yeah, go for it.
It's just an RSC run, right? It's just an RSC run, whereas you'll need a full market run with the ties open.
Meaning more inputs, right? Like as if the market was solving based on, at the 4 a.m. or 5 a.m., wherever this potential, item lands, is all the associated inputs solve, determine what those quote unquote advisory schedules look like, and then traders could utilize that information as they deem fit. Is that where you're going, Stuart?
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
I believe so, Mark. I think you'll do your advisory run and then a full market run to get the outputs.
Got it. No, that's good feedback. I appreciate that. And if anyone from the ISO wanted to weigh in, by all means, raise your hand. But what I wanted to kind of, also help tee up here for this first item is, help me understand the risks associated to participants to the extent they're not participating timely in this day-ahead nomination cycle, right? Is it under procurement or over procurement potentially, which means there's, heavy financial exposure there? I would like to get a sense of that, and I think some of that information will kind of help feed what the underlying issue is here. Joe, from SRP, I see your hand come back up. Thank you. Go for it.
Yeah, so this will be probably a little different regionally. So I'll only be speaking for Arizona-based generation. We do not have in-state storage. We have very few tools to swing on, if you will, in the name of liquidity, once the day-ahead trading system concludes. The vast majority of total volume for a given day of flow trades in the day ahead, what we've kind of been calling the timely cycle, are same day gas markets, ID 1, 2, 3, and even to a lesser degree the evening cycle has much less liquidity. Can you go out and buy a certain amount of gas to kind of true things up? Sure, but you would not want to have a significant portion of your overall scheduled gas volumes left to be procured after that morning trading window. Again, we don't have major storage. We don't have any in-state storage to lean on. Pipelines have restrictions to the extent you can lean on line pack without being penalized. So, but really, it's like it simply comes down to liquidity. And essentially, it would be like, trying to go, trade a block of stock after the New York session closes. It's going to be a little bit more problematic. And for us, it's very problematic. So again, just comes down to volume and when the majority of it is trading.
Got it. And just to kind of help on the last slide here, assuming we have time to jump into it today, I am going to be looking for stakeholder feedback on potential survey-related questions that we can kind of send out there for anonymous answers. And one of those questions that I wanted to potentially propose was, what level of volume is actually getting purchased in that day ahead time frame. That way, when we kind of start talking about some of the real time, and it's, in a few slides, some of the real time bidding flexibility items that we've heard on this call, what percentage of that are we really addressing in the overall portion of this particular topic? So I appreciate your feedback there, Joe. So I heard the Southwest feedback. Anyone from the Northwest or any California entities willing to weigh in here? Not hearing anything. All right, let's talk a little bit. So I appreciate the feedback on the advisory run. I made a few notes here. It's absolutely something we could capture in that discussion paper around, a quote unquote true market run, based on those associated inputs that are available to the market at the time, and potentially 4 a.m. being much better than 5 a.m. And I haven't heard any pushback on that. So let me kind of pause there to see, is that accurate? Is there any other feedback on that topic? All right, not hearing any. Fantastic. All right, let's talk about gas spot market price visibility. So this one, I must admit, is interesting to me because on the last few calls, I believe I heard a few entities talk about having that associated visibility where others don't. And I'm trying to understand, is that simply, a service that is being paid for versus not, or is it, based on the associated region that you're in, based on the associated pipelines that feed your system? Is it more of a system challenge as to the reason why you don't have this gas spot market price visibility, or is it truly just boiled down to an associated service that potentially could be getting paid for? So let me pause there and see if I can get a reaction to anyone willing to weigh in on that. Michelle, go for it.
So just want to get clarification here on the spot market service. I mean, you have an indicator, but that usually affects real time. Primary affects real time.
So in day ahead, yeah, talk to me about day ahead, and then we'll transition to real time. Thank you.
You also have some indicator, and I don't know how other utilities do it, but on the day ahead, we really try to lean heavily on procuring the GDA. That might be.
Can you tell me what GDA stands for my own knowledge?
Gas Daily Index.
Okay.
It's essentially the trades, the average trades that end up being exchanged on ICE.
Okay.
If there is an ICE account, you have an indicator of what those prices are going to be settled at.
Okay.
And then in the fixed price, there's also same day trades, so you also have some kind of indication of what the prices are going to be on the real time market.
Okay, so it sounds like there is a service out there available. I heard you say, to the extent you have an ICE account, you have that visibility. And it's that associated average price of those indexes. So that's good to know. For the entities that weighed in on this being a challenge to them, do you mind opining onto what those challenges are? Are you comfortable speaking up here in this forum? Or is this no longer a challenge and should not necessarily be represented as a challenge that the community is facing? All right, not hearing anything. Oh, Michelle, your hand's back up. Go for it.
I'd like to comment on the pricing itself for the inputs. When we're talking about running this this market, right, this advisory run, I really think that the output of this advisory run is going to be dependent on this pricing, because, I mean, if we look at it, are you
talking about the gas pricing?
Correct, the
okay.
gas pricing at each hub, and I'm thinking because that's going to affect your optimization, just like you pay attention to what's being forecast on the renewables and your other resources.
Mm-hmm.
The gas price really affects the overall dispatch. So I think that when CAISO, and I'm assuming that the entities are going to input what the projection pricing at each hub is going to be, that those inputs on the gas side is really going to affect the output on this advisory run. If I'm understanding that that's going to be what the forecast is going to be evaluated on.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, and I think that's something, as we get into potential, later on in the process around whether it's through this working group or, once we actually dive into associated straw proposal and things like that, if this new advisory run is something that kind of honors those principles, we can kind of dive into what those inputs should be and get a little bit more granular there. I do take your point, and I think it's important, the commitment costs at the end of the day absolutely drive potentially what the market outcomes would be, as well as some of those other, load forecasts, variable energy resource forecasts, outages. I mean, all the associated inputs that go into that day-ahead run are each critically important. And obviously, if the run's at 4 a.m. versus 5 a.m. versus 7 a.m., those numbers are only as good as to what is known at that associated time, right? So there's always going to be that associated caveat, which is why I was talking about, how much gas is getting procured in day-ahead NOM versus real-time, and that will definitely be a survey question there to respect everybody's, I don't want to say strategies, but just associated business practices around that. So I hear your point, Michelle, and I appreciate you raising that.
Yeah, and I know that we haven't talked about like how the optimization is going to run, but I'm assuming that there's going to have to be some kind of principles in place and timelines for the entities to put in the pricing and that run to essentially be able to be spit out by this 4 or 5 a.m. Time frame.
Right, whether it's, entities putting it in or, today, and Katie will talk a little bit more about that later in the education session, when the ISO pulls that average gas price between 8 and 9 a.m. for the commitment cost to be utilized in that day ahead run, whatever that process is there a opportunity there to leverage that just to be a little bit sooner based on the known issues or excuse me, known prices. So yeah, all fair points. I appreciate that. Let me see if I do have one more hand up. I see Grace at SCE. You may be on mute on your end, Grace.
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I'm subbing in for my boss, Constantine Louis. And just to address wanting to know what volume traded day ahead, do you guys have Platts? Gas Daily? The subscription?
When you say you guys, do you mean the ISO?
Yeah.
I see Katie on from the ISO. I also see Guillermo as one of the attendees. So I would lean on them to answer that question. If not, that's definitely something we could follow up on.
Yeah. So let me just give you a flavor of what happened for tomorrow. Like almost 199,000 traded for next day for fixed price SoCal Citygate. And then same day traded about 73,000. And Mondays are usually more busy. I hear myself echo, so bear with me.
No, we don't hear it on our end, so you're good there, Grace. And I did confirm that we do utilize Platts pricing for the overall calculation and things like that. But that is, point well taken that there may be some of that information as to how much is procured on that day ahead horizon versus real time that we can absolutely take back.
Sure. So when you look at the pricing, just look to your right, like 4 columns over, and you could see it. And that's it. I just wanted to help out there.
I appreciate that, Grace. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Good conversation on that first item there. I appreciate everyone's input. Let's move on to cost recovery processes too burdensome and timely. So again, the quote-unquote issue or challenge we've heard is current process for a manual reference level change request is on a resource-by-resource basis and has an 8 a.m. deadline that conflicts with gas trader activities. So some of the things we've heard around potentially resolving this particular issue is provide ability for participants to submit at fuel zone level or SCID level, and I put a question mark there, right? Is it, are we intending this submission to potentially provide, when we do that automated reference level adjustment request, do we want to see that at the SCID level, meaning all resources mapped to that particular entity, or does it make sense to be at the fuel zone level during that submission? But allow, instead of right now on the resource by resource basis, which is some of the feedback we heard around being extremely burdensome, to allow for more submission on more resources at one time. And then there was conversations for at least for the manual reference level change request to remove that assigned deadline so that traders can submit requests accordingly as the need arises. And I have a few questions to see, to kind of challenge each one of those, potential proposed solutions to this issue, and I'm hoping this conversation, again, helps feed the underlying issue that we can capture as a problem statement, which is one of the goals of this, right? Hearing a lot of the trades happen, 4, 5 a.m., 6 a.m., help me understand why the 8 a.m. deadline isn't sufficient, right? So the purpose of that is individuals are seeing what those associated costs are going to be for their commitment costs for their resources. So you see the average prices that the ISO is utilizing in that market run as an input to those bids. The automated change level requests allow for, a certain level of reasonableness pertaining to those thresholds of potentially going up an additional 10% on that actual fuel price itself. So I'm trying to understand why 8 a.m. isn't enough time to kind of get those in, or what the true issue is there with that 8 a.m. deadline. So let me pause there and see if I can get a reaction for those who actually utilize that process. And Katie will be going into details a little bit later from an educational perspective as to what that process looks like. So anyone willing to weigh in there as to why the current 8 a.m. deadline doesn't make sense? Or is it not an issue at all right now? Because on the last call, I believe I heard it conflicts with some of the trading activities, to the extent a participant doesn't have, I would say, sufficient workforce, for lack of better terms, enough individuals to, they're wearing multiple hats, they're setting up the energy trades, they're setting up the gas trades, and all that fun stuff. Is it a resourcing issue, or is that 8 a.m. truly conflicting with something that, we should evaluate as a community of potentially moving that manual reference change request timeline? Not seeing any hands. All right. I saw Darren's hand pop up. He beat you barely there, Stuart. So let me go to Darren at Idaho.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I don't think you've got, I understand there's a lot of index trading, and I haven't traded for a bit. I've got some traders that might want to chime in on this on the call for my gas leader, but I don't know if you've got really good price certainty and knowledge by 8 a.m. of what that day ahead index is going to settle at, if that's the target you're shooting for, or what price you are trying to recover for next day. So I think there's a problem in that, in addition to a resource problem like you suggested, Mark. I think you've got traders who are still trying to pass the baton from day ahead trades that they've been doing since whatever 5 o'clock-ish, moving into intraday one, which now trades right kind of as that timely slowing down, and they've gotten, in our neck of the woods until 9 a.m., so they're working on that. And then you also want them to go through and put together a level reference change request on this, for this matter. It just seems, well, it is. It's frankly, it's congested and doesn't work.
Yeah.
So hopefully that, I think there'll be other people that will pair it into that and agree with that sentiment.
Okay. Can you, so the costs that are utilized in that day ahead time frame, I'm trying to understand kind of what triggers from an external perspective the need to use this manual reference level change request. What's, I don't want to say failing, but what's not working with the current processes today to try to capture and allow for up to a 25% adder in the day ahead market to kind of capture any change or movement in that price before the energy market timelines close. Can you, Darren, if you wouldn't mind, maybe help provide some clarity as to what triggers, like what's the underlying trigger there to really utilize that process? Is, are the costs that are getting, averaged out, and Katie will talk a little bit more about that later, simply that far off, and the 25% adder doesn't cover for that, and therefore hey, I know it's going to be 40% above that current cost. I need to make up that 40% now. Can you weigh in on that if possible, Darren?
Yeah,
if not, Stuart, I'll ask you the same question.
Sure, Mark, I can fly high on that. In the Pacific Northwest, as you may or may not know, Sumas, which is where we do a lot of our procurement at, has probably been the highest volatility spot market and I don't know, potentially financial forward markets that we've seen over the last, well, since the Enbridge event in 18. So we're seeing balls that are well above 100 on these extreme days when you would expect this scenario to come into play. And so 25% doesn't really scratch it for us. And then you add, so now that being said, I've never done a level reference change request, but yes. So it's, for starters, I don't think the 25% covers it. And I don't,
Got it.
I'm only speaking in the Pacific Northwest.
Yep.
So I guess,
No,
does that answer your question?
It does. It does. I heard volatility, right? The volatility between what's captured versus what's materialized, and that delta is.
And we're going to see, you know, whether everyone believes this or not, volatility is going to continue to be a real thing, and it's going to be a real problem. And managing it's going to be even more difficult than it has been in the past due to all the coal, basically, the coal units going down and being taken offline, and gas being more relied on. In addition to that, I think just the electrical generation itself is causing these swings, and the pipelines have been less tolerable. We've noticed in our area over the last year and a half of allowing OBAs balancing through packing and drafting the pipe. In fact, this goes into the note, and maybe too soon. I can table this if you want to wait, but the note, the comments that we put in there, you know, we've been under OFOs in our area for 180 days of this 2023. So about 70% of the time, we've been under a, you know, you can't pack, you can't draft, so you got to be on
right.
rate. Very, very, very difficult to manage. And so that being said, every end user out there on this call, if you got your ears on, I mean, they all know we become a price taker when that small window of liquidity is out of when it's gone, and you'll be held over a barrel if you've got to go out and procure gas. And so I guess what I'm saying is that the 25% just doesn't cut it, and we're going to see it's going to be even further from scratching, I guess, the surface of getting cost recovery and making sure that we're covered on the fuel costs in the future. That's my humble opinion.
Right, and I think you know, at least in my opinion, and I think others on this call would agree, is, you know, a sufficient market, or, you know, when we talk about those core principles we discussed earlier on in this working group, a sufficient market would mean the cost recovery is a lot less utilized, right? Because those are being represented in those market runs. No, that's really good feedback, Darren. I appreciate you willing to chime in there. Stuart, you had your hand up and then you dropped it. I want to make sure if you had something to add to this, I gave you the opportunity before maybe seeing if there's anyone else willing to weigh in. All right, go ahead, Stuart. I see your hand back up.
Thanks, Mark. No, I would just second everything Darren said, and in particular the volatility. I don't see the volatility going away. And then I'm not that familiar with the automated submittal, so forgive me. My understanding originally was there only was this manual submittal available, and it leads me to the question, you know, why do the participants have to submit anything? Can this not be fully automated, you know, in some fair and equitable basis? Because that was primarily where my comments came from, and this is too burdensome. Why does a participant have to submit anything? And maybe ISO has concerns about that, but you know, I think if we could try and answer that question, or is there a way that this could be automated and still be fair? You know, particularly if your resource is getting called to do more after the market run, you've got to go out and, you know, procure more gas. Is that maybe the starting point, and for a fully automated cost recovery at that point based on some index? That was it, Mark.
No, I appreciate that, Stuart. Thank you. And I see Grant's hand up. Before I go to Grant, and we will touch on the automated reference level process a little bit later. But at a high level, there are some reasonableness thresholds, you know, that this this reasonableness threshold is detailed in the BPM, and to the extent the price was utilized the day before, that threshold for the fuel price itself is 10%, whereas if let's say it's a weekend or a holiday, that particular threshold or reasonableness threshold jumps up to 25%. But again, that's just on the fuel price, which is obviously an input to the overall costs calculations itself. And I think what I hear you saying, Stuart, is if that automated process were to be enhanced and, appropriate changes made there wouldn't be a need or a much lesser need for this manual reference level change request process. So I appreciate that feedback, and that's good feedback. One thing I wanted to ask is, in the event there is still a need for this manual reference level change request, when we talk about a deadline, right, because I think that deadline through the stakeholder process last go around on this was really to allow sufficient time to kind of validate those costs, input those costs into the market so that the participant has an opportunity to see those costs reflected and then resubmit their bids accordingly. Are we saying 9 a.m. would be a better time deadline in that manual reference level change request? Like what? Because again, this is an input into that day ahead market, so trying to test what that looks like as well. All right, let's go to Grant at Willhead.
Yeah, I would agree with Stuart's comments 100%. I want to pile on just a bit.
Do you mind speaking up just a little bit, Grant? I'm sorry, it's really hard for me to hear you.
I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, much better, sir. Thank you.
Okay, so I agree with Stuart's comments, and just to add on there a bit, I do believe it can be an automated process, but in comment of the 110% and 125%, those levels were determined when the market volatility was so much less. The world has changed, and we routinely see movements of 150, 175, 200%, and so CAISO needs to go back and take another look at the analytics that were run because they're way out of date. The second thing is in terms of timing, yes, when things really get that wild, 8 a.m. is just pushing it for anybody's staff. And so the later in the process that we can have these deadlines trigger, the better, because there's just a lot going on when you have that much volatility.
Got it. No, good feedback, Grant. Thank you. All right, Joe from SRP.
Hang on one sec for me. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I was just going to say, and I might be referencing, I might be speaking to a different question, but if we're kind of truing up gas prices to reflect changes within the day, and maybe the changes between day ahead and more of a real-time market, there are no real-time, at least, again, speaking for Arizona, there are no real-time indices that we can really reference. All the widely used, as somebody else mentioned earlier on the call, typically GDA, Platts indices, at least that reference gas points that we procure at, are day ahead.
I hear what you're saying, and I'm trying to be cognizant, and maybe we can have an offline conversation of if you don't procure enough in the day ahead or any delta in the day ahead, how is that made up for in real time?
I'm sorry, if we don't procure any gas day ahead?
No. Let's say you procure your gas day ahead, and then based on, I'm sure you guys manage this today, based on changing load conditions, VERS, all that fun stuff, generator goes out, whatever, real time rolls around and you end up using less gas.
Okay.
How is that managed today?
How would we manage that?
Mm-hmm.
It would be the same three. You would either you would attempt to inject into storage if you contract for storage services. You would make a same day bilateral sale, or to the extent it's within tolerances, it would be essentially become part of your imbalance on the pipeline.
Got it. Thank you. And I think that might be, it sounds like there was some geographic interplay there based on the gas system itself. Would that be, by a thumbs up or something like that, would that be accurate? I see your hand back up, Joe.
That would be accurate.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I just want to make sure I was tracking. Appreciate that. Okay, because when I talked about, removing, based on stakeholder feedback, removing the assigned deadline, I naturally test some of these conversations in my mind as we're talking about them to those principles. And I think about, feasibility and things like that. But I think what I just heard through conversation is to the extent there's a need, right? I think the true solution is let's get those costs represented sooner, so there's not a need to utilize these processes. But to the extent we do have to go through these processes from a stakeholder perspective, the later that deadline can be, the better. I hear you guys loud and clear. Awesome. I haven't heard anything from the ISO. ISO team, is there anything you guys wanted to ask the community before we move on to the next slide on either of these two topics here? Just simply raise your hand if you have one. Not seeing any. All right, perfect. Thank you guys, good conversation. Oh, Dan Williams. Dan, you're gonna have to state your affiliation these days, sir.
Hey, thanks, Mark. Dan Williams with the Energy Authority. I apologize, I came in a little bit late to the call. Have we talked about the FERC cost recovery process at this point, or is that coming later?
That's touching on number 2 there, right? We were just talking about some of the qualifiers to even kind of go down that route, which is that manual reference level change request. I didn't capture here the FERC process itself, but if you wanted to opine on that, by all means do so.
So I'm a bit beyond my headlights here. I should say maybe tail lights, because I'm having a hard time remembering some of the details going back to the 2021 cost recovery filings that a number of entities made following that February 2021 event. But memory serving and quick look back, there was some discussion in the protests that the ISO made to the various filings that entities, if they wanted to get after the fact cost recovery, should have bid the max allowable commitment costs under the CCW policy that was in place at the time. And remember there being some discussion of that. I can't remember which ISO meeting it was, but there was just some discussion of that as a kind of interesting policy or take on the CCW policy in place at the time. And without expecting a response on anything right now, I'll just say it may be worth entities going back and looking at some of those cost recovery filings that were made by, I don't know, Sempra. I think there was one, EDF, maybe one or two others, and looking at some of the back and forth between ISO legal staff and those filings and the entities. I haven't tracked back to where those settled out. I'm not sure if some ended up in settlement agreements, but just I remember reading those when they came out, and it really driving home just how difficult it is to deal with these either
those FERC filings
explicit or implicit requirements that showed up in the way that the ISO responded to those after the fact requests.
No, I appreciate that. And what I'll do, and I appreciate you kind of pulling that out of memory on the fly. That was impressive. I think what we'll do there is I'll ask the ISO team to take that back for those on the call listening. And Dan, if you missed it, I heard you state you joined the call a little late. We are going to be working on a matrix, which will kind of outline the associated problems. I will add as one of those problems, it will be reflected in the discussion paper as well as that matrix, the FERC after cost recovery mechanism being burdensome. And we'll go back and look at those associated filings and try to capture that there as well.
Yeah, and just specifically I think there are things to be learned out of the, ISO's responses in those processes, just, kind of the back and forth between entities that made the filings and then kind of the interpretation of how entities are expected to engage with the, tariff language and that sort of thing. Because, there's kind of the letter of what's written and then kind of how it actually ends up playing out in,
Yep.
in reality.
No, good points. I appreciate you raising that. Thank you, Dan.
Yep.
All right. Isabella, let's go to the next slide. Good conversation so far. Appreciate the engagement, team. All right. So here I'm hoping for quite a bit of engagement. So challenges expressed to date continued. Bidding flexibility restricts the capability for participants to reflect costs, right? So this is kind of upstream of the automated reference level adjustment process and manual reference level adjustment process, right? That is, the quote unquote caps we'll talk about, kind of going back to Darren's point at Idaho around some of the OFO exposure. So Darren, I'd definitely look for you to chime in on that last bullet there. So let's dive in here. So one of the primary issues we heard was day ahead commitment costs do not accurately reflect appropriate gas price for the full 24-hour horizon, right? So, it was brought up by this community and stakeholders that the gas market timelines and energy market timelines don't align. The discussion paper appendices kind of provided some history on that and why that is. And I think what we heard through this form is if hour ending 1 through 7 and hour ending 8 through 24 reflected the appropriate price, understanding that price is an average, per that methodology of the 3 associated indices that are utilized. If those hours reflected that particular gas market's price, this necessarily wouldn't be as large of an issue. Let me pause there and see, based on what I'm hearing, is that a relatively accurate statement there from a, potential solution or remedy to that horizon? I see Michelle with her hand up from LA.
So I'll comment to this with like how LA has been handling this. This is going to fall heavily on the optimization that CAISO built out. I know that they're used to putting how the energy market runs 24 hours a calendar day. The gas world runs essentially that pricing that gets traded we procure. It's effective 7 to 7 in Pacific Standard Time.
Right.
And what we've done in-house is we've tailored optimizations to reflect that. And I do think it changes the dispatch because on today, gas prices settle higher than what they were for the weekend. So if you input the higher gas prices, it might actually dispatch your natural gas resources down or vice versa.
Right. So, Michelle, am I hearing you in support of reflecting, air quote, appropriate in support? Okay.
In support of reflecting that and letting CAISO know that it's gonna end up being a lot of work or a lot of thought put into the optimization component.
Got it.
That spits out those results.
Got it. Okay, so I hear LA in support. I see a name I haven't talked to in quite a while. David Redding at AES. Hope you're doing well. And what do you got for the community today?
The whole issue on gas day versus power day, to me, and what I deal with is a lot of the issues I really had have gone away with the change on the pipes and how they administer OFO related penalty dollars. They actually allocate, at least SoCal Gas does that on a per day equivalent basis. So, and then the bid tools that I have, well, the bid models are built to be able to have different gas prices between those first hours of the day and the rest of the gas day. If you actually have a difference in pricing of the gas, there's kind of two separate issues of the penalty aspect of it. They kind of have that aligned with the power day, but you can have your energy bid curves reflect two different prices. Right. Now, maybe mitigation, some of the mitigation things that CAISO will apply may cause some issues on that if there's enough price differences between, say, the first 7 hours of the day and the rest of the day, something like that. But anyway.
So appreciate you weighing in there, David. Would you say if the underlying gas price, kind of going back to Michelle's point and some of the other stakeholders on this call, you know, understanding that it's 7 to 7, if that gas price was reflective in the market, it would make the outcome, you know, understanding that, you know, you have that bidding flexibility of up to those caps of 125% for commitment costs for proxy units or 110% for registered units. And again, Katie will go into that a little bit later from an educational perspective for all of those who potentially don't participate in the day-ahead market today. Do you agree that a more reflective cost utilized in the optimization is a better thing than where we are today? Or are you saying entities have tools? Go ahead.
Anything that reflects a better cost structure is probably you have to answer yes, and just generically to that. Whether or not you get enough juice out of the lemon on it, I don't know.
Gotcha. I appreciate your feedback. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Anyone else like to weigh in on this topic? Does anybody disagree with that and think there doesn't need to be a change there? I see Michelle's hand up again, but let me see if there's anybody else wanting to weigh in. Michelle may be responding to David there. All right. I see both hands. I saw Grace's hand go up and then it went back down. Go ahead, Grace.
I would like to add that just like Sumas area, how they have so many OFOs, I just counted SoCal Pipeline's OFOs, and they call it 60% of the time this year, which is really high, and the year is not even done yet, just to give you a taste of the environment. Yeah, it's not easy, and there is a high volatility, especially same day versus day ahead. That's it.
Got it. Thank you. And I think that kind of touches a little bit on the current associated caps. And, you know, I heard participants weigh in on potentially the need to change those caps as the data analytics, when those caps were established, volatility was much, much lower. Especially if, you know, there's data supporting a lot more of these OFOs from the community. So I definitely think that's something to take back and look at as a community. So good feedback there. Thank you. All right. Let's move on to the next one here, because again, on this one, I heard two sides of the coin, and I definitely want to hear from, you know, I want to hear from the Southwest, I want to hear from California parties, and I definitely want to hear from Northwest as well. So today, master file utilizes a static heat rate, and that heat rate is used by the optimization when calculating the commitment costs. And again, Katie's going to go into what exactly that looks like from a formula perspective in coming slides. What we've heard a few calls back, I think on the first, if my memory serves me correctly, on the first call, we heard that entities, in order to manage this, entities kind of test their units seasonally, and what they do is they update master file to reflect those costs, right? So call it 4 times a year, depending on where they're geographically located based on climate and things like that. They reflect a updated heat rate value. Where some other entities say, hey, there may be a need for the ability to essentially change that heat rate more frequently. So what I would like to tease out here is how much more frequently, right? Help us understand what that need is, and let's discuss that as a group. So if you wouldn't mind raising your hand, chiming in on this particular topic, I'd appreciate it. All right, I see Darren from Idaho. Go for it.
Thanks again, Mark. I think this rings true, particularly when you get into 4-season climates or in the shoulder seasons where you can see 40, 50 degree ambient temperature differences. There is some heat rate delta there that needs to be accommodated for that might be outside that seasonal adjustment you're talking about. And I know that's kind of, I guess, regurgitating what's been discussed already. We bid these bilaterally when we're working with what we're doing currently in our day-ahead markets and our real-time markets, but what's not participating in the EIM with a dynamic heat rate table that's by ambient temperature, by wet bulb, humidity factor, and of course you've got inlet heaters out here in in Idaho that have to turn on so your air intakes don't freeze up, and so there's lots of different things that we have learned over the years as to the performance of these units and big time degradation issues associated with ambient temperature and humidity primarily. And so we try and get as accurate as we can. And I guess my opinion is, or our opinion is, there's no reason that an EDAM or Cal ISO or this market shouldn't as well. Now, that being said, I understand there's a lot of dynamic moving parts here and not all units are the same. We went through and scratched at this after our last meeting or our first meeting. And we think we could get more in line with seasonal versus, a sliding rule that's, has a variable or dynamic input based on the temperature of the day. But the truth is that there is some change when you go from 50 or 45 degrees in the morning, like it was here in Boise this morning, and it's going to be 90 this afternoon.
Got it. So that's kind of from Idaho's perspective, it sounds like there's a geographical need based on those temperature swings to, it sounds like you guys, may be able to make seasonal work or even, monthly. I mean, the master file process allows for, as long as the request is within 10 days. I guess I was trying to get a sense of, to the extent there needs to be, I heard you use the word dynamic, is it 3 pre-established heat rates in the master file that would suffice, that potentially could be updated on a monthly basis or something like that to allow that flexibility?
Well, I discussed this with some other folks with ISO, and really what we're using, and this was what was discussed in that call, whether it's possible or not, I don't know, but we're using just ambient temperature input. It's effectively that, and that gets us close enough, or would get us close enough. So I don't know if it's, and we have a forecast. We know what the temperature is, what's going on. You guys are using that currently, so it could be used, incorporated with a minus 10 degree up to 120 degree, ambient temperature sliding scale as well. That was the original thought. That we had some discussion on that. Nothing was ever really determined, but that's kind of where it was left. But
got it.
Yeah.
Okay. No, that's good feedback. Thank you, Darren. Are there any other entities seeing this as a challenge? Anyone willing to weigh in? If not, by all means, I mean, obviously, Southwest, it's very hot, and I assume it gets cold there at night in the desert. So by all means, reflect those in your comments. I definitely look forward to them. All right, good conversation there. Let's talk about real-time commitment costs that are fixed in real time. So what I mean by that is, as many of you know or may know, once there's a day-ahead awarded hour, for that particular hour in real time, those costs are quote unquote locked in for that day ahead awarded hour. And then the current process allows for an entity to reflect a different commitment costs in real time for non-awarded day ahead hours. Once one of those non-awarded day ahead hours gets awarded in real time, those costs are now fixed for the day. What we've heard here is this presents challenges, again, around volatility from a load forecast, variable energy resource forecast, volatility around the unit getting inked and or decked, as well as that potential OFO exposure that has definitely been a common theme on this call. So what we've heard is to allow for different commitment costs to be reflected regardless of previous commitments. And again, you know, keeping those principles in mind, I kind of wanted to test that a little bit, or at least provide you know, food for thought as we, you know, move on throughout this stakeholder process. Is units have minimum uptime, minimum on time, and you know, some of these intertemporal constraints. And you know, to the extent, let's say for example, a unit has a 3-hour minimum on time, that particular unit gets committed. Are we saying the real-time cost should be fixed based on that commitment to honor that minimum on time, to avoid the potential for an entity to up those costs once they get committed? Or are we saying, you know, still open that up and allow for new costs to be reflected in subsequent hours and things like that, regardless of commitments? So things to think about. You know, again, that matrix I referenced earlier on this call will absolutely kind of address the reasoning behind today's functionality, and I'll list there some of the challenges: OFO exposure, volatility, things like that, and the need to potentially recruit more of those costs in real time being reflected in those bids. But I wanted to kind of just throw that out there for the community to noodle on. If you guys have any reaction to that, by all means, raise your hand. I'd be happy to call on you. But then I definitely wanted to also touch on this bid mitigation changes during periods of gas volatility, because I'd like to understand that a little bit more. But before we go there, let's see if there's any comments or questions. All right, not hearing anything. Hopefully what I stated made sense and gives you guys something to noodle on there as we look for comments and things like that. All right, bid mitigation changes during periods of gas volatility. So I heard, you know, hey, you know, kind of going back to David Redding's point, you know, one of the tools is in today's world is that energy bid could kind of try to reflect those increased costs, right, with respect to bid caps and things like that. Now, if you're mitigated, that kind of negates that energy bid curve. And to the extent you're mitigated, are we saying there potentially should be a change in those bid mitigation rules during periods of gas volatility? How does gas volatility get flagged, right, for that bid mitigation, right? I would like to hear a little bit more on this topic to try to, at least as the facilitator, get my head wrapped around it and something I could take back to the ISO team there. So anyone willing to comment on that? Darren from Idaho. Go ahead, sir.
Sure, thanks again. I'll just say gas price volatility and OFOs go hand in hand. When you get a market spread, particularly what I can state out here in a bidirectional pipe that goes northbound and southbound, depending on how the market's flowing and what season it is, you get a great divide, a price degradation or price shift between 2 points. So you're going to have an OFO because this particular pipeline that we operate on is oversubscribed, so you get compressor stations that get full, and you have to. And remember, an OFO doesn't mean the same on a bidirectional pipe. An
Right.
OFO is different. We call it an entitlement, and so if you look like, for example, SoCal's got, I think they currently got a OFO with a $10 penalty, so you know what your cost on exceeding it is. On a bidirectional pipe, that cost isn't known, and really what you're expected to do. You've got contract obligated CD out there capacity that you have to displace going through a compressed station. So for example, in the winter, if gas is trying to go into the north because it's nice and benign down in Phoenix, and SoCal's nice and warm, but it's freezing cold up in Seattle area. So all the gas tries to go northbound. Well, Idaho Power has to move gas. We have to go buy gas at Sumas and move it down Northwest Pipeline southbound to create displacement. That's what an OFO means on a bidirectional pipe. And you don't know the cost. There's not a penalty associated with it. It's not an entitlement. So the price you're going to pay is unknown until evening cycle. Because you don't even get your orders on what you have to buy as far as volumetric requirements to create that displacement until the evening cycle. So I guess my main point is all OFOs are not equal. Considering the pipes are running a lot tighter, and we operate on more than just one, they're running a lot tighter now than they have been in the past, because they don't have flexibility, and you get this price volatility associated with OFO penalty that you don't know the price of. It becomes a significant layer of economic risk for any shipper out there who's trying to be held in for this day ahead reward. So you've got to react to that real time commitment cost. They've got to be flexible. They've got to move. And frankly,
so are you saying OFO, to the extent an OFO in place, that may be a good place to at least start the discussion on taking a look at how and if bids are mitigated, and if so, by how much?
Yeah, I think anytime you've got an OFO on, for us in particular, I'm only speaking on a bidirectional pipe, so it might be different if you have price certainty and what your penalty might be, say going to SoCal, but nonetheless, for us, it's about buying a fuel and flowing it counterflow to what everyone else is trying to do, because that's your obligation as a shipper. So we don't even know. And so yes, absolutely. It needs to be opened up anytime there is a, entitlement OFO where the pipe is constrained. And that's going to be most of the time, because I think I'm hearing, and I know what I'm seeing is we're seeing 75% of the time we're under OFO warning and subject to penalty and subject to having to pay that.
No, this is all good feedback. And for my own knowledge, are OFOs, are they declared by a certain time each day, or can that happen like right now?
OFOs, and this is, again, I'll speak, for example, on Northwest Pipeline, they can send out a warning, meaning you're under warning, which means they can call it up to for evening cycle that day, basically. So same day. Okay. So we don't even know, we wouldn't know until we get it past that timely. Because what they're going to do is reconcile all the timely nominations to see where that constraint lies and decide whether or not they need to call must flow or contractual obligations for displacement.
Got it. No, good feedback there, Darren. Thank you. I appreciate you educating me on that. Let's go to Joe at SRP, and then we'll go to David, and then I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Katie in the interest of time to kind of start walking through some of these educational items. Yeah, so, Joe.
Yes, Joe,
go ahead.
I just wanted to echo, thank you, Darren, for I thought those comments were really well laid out. Very similar, again, situation in the Southwest, where one of the two pipelines that serve us, here we call them line pack alerts. Different names essentially for something similar. They can be announced same day. They can be announced next day. The penalties do change a little bit, whether they're same or next. However, at least for us here, a line pack alert really shouldn't be addressed as a financial tool in your toolbox. So if there is a low line pack alert, for example, meaning that we would be penalized if we were to burn, let's say, greater than 104% of our given schedule on a given pipeline, that's a hard cap. And you don't just blow right through that, pay the penalty, try to reflect it in your gas cost, because over time you will essentially become a bad actor. You will destroy the goodwill that you have with the pipes. So I just want to kind of make the point that it's really a hard cap to adhere to volumetrically, and not really something that can be mitigated all the time by just simply socializing or having the gas price revised to include the potential penalty exposure, if that makes sense.
Right. No, for sure. I think you're touching on the reliability, and I just realized that I do have another slide that I think touches on that a little bit.
Okay, I'm sorry.
But that's really a helpful comment. Thank you. David, if you wouldn't mind adding your comment somewhat quickly. Apologies, I'm looking at the time here and definitely want to make sure we leave time for Katie and her presentation. Adrian, if you wouldn't mind unmuting David.
I was trying to get unmuted there. You look at OFOs, you also, those pipes will have different stage levels of OFO with the penalty tier structure associated with them. And oftentimes what that stage level is declared can influence what the volatility may look like. For example, like on SoCal Gas, if you have a stage 1, you've got a 25% penalty. That's pretty minimal. If you have a stage 3.1 OFO, you've got a $10 penalty, or a 3.2, a $15 penalty, and you can have 20 or $25 penalty. And also think, looking back at this past winter, January, February are probably pretty good time frames to look at some of the extreme cases of kind of crazy scenarios that can happen.
No, that's good feedback, and I think that's something we could take back and look at as we talk about bid mitigation and overall OFO exposure and things like that. So I appreciate that, David. All right, Isabel. So Grace, I see your hand. I will come to you on the next slide. Isabel, if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide. All right. Resource-specific limitations, and you know, I definitely don't want to rush this conversation, so apologies in advance, Katie. So some of the things we've heard: participants are unable to reflect or switch fuel zones easily and timely. And one of the proposed answers to that problem is to provide the flexibility for participants to switch those fuel zones easily to the extent, and I think this is key, to the extent it's a pre-established fuel zone and it's already been appropriately demonstrated that this particular resource has the ability to pull from either one of these particular pipelines. Let me pause there and see if, is this accurately articulated based on conversations to date? Is there a need to provide this flexibility? And we'll go from there. So I saw a new hand pop up. Let me go to Darren at Idaho, because I believe, Darren, this was reflected in your guys' comments that are now publicly available. And then I'm going to come back to you, Grace.
Yes, thanks, Mark. Just to agree, this is reflecting how we want to do it. And again, being in the middle of a pipeline and subject to that that teeter-tottering. The pipe tilts and it goes one way, tilts, it goes the other way. So, yep, it looks good. Thank you. Yep,
no problem. And I guess I would ask the community, does anyone disagree with providing that ability? Again, this would, you know, at least from the point of view of just kind of reading this on the surface, again, it provides a more sufficient market. You know, is this a common issue with multiple units out there? I know there's a few in California that I've worked on specifically, but I would like to hear from the rest of the group. So let me go to Grace at SCE, who I believe represents quite a bit of generation and may be able to weigh in on this particular item as well.
I just wanted to make a comment about agreeing with the other person who said there's high OFOs or low OFOs on the SoCal system. Like, it's common, just to give you a flavor, like they call the OFO that's at $10, $15. So it's common to see the volatility from day ahead to same day and secondary imbalance market to move about $1. I don't have a comment here, but that's all I just wanted to add. And just to give you a flavor too, that in June, SoCal called an OFO every day, and it seems like they're going to call an OFO every day in September. That's it.
Got it. Thank you. Appreciate that. David, is that an old hand up? Not hearing anything. I'm assuming it is.
Yes, it's old.
All right. Thank you. All right. Any other comments on this first item here? All right. Let's move to the next one. Use limitation qualifications are too restrictive. Right. So here's some of the remedies, or at least things we've heard that I would like to dive a little bit deeper on to see, you know, what how large is this particular problem across the community? So qualifications need to account for each unique BAA's reliability needs, and in quotes their ancillary services and things of that nature. Is there anyone willing to weigh in on this call to provide a little bit more detail around this particular item, or is this something that participants are also facing? You know, are there other participants that are facing this challenge as well, to where they would like to register a use limited resource? That way those associated opportunity costs get reflected in the actual bid itself and in the optimization. So let me pause there. I see Lindsay from NB. Go for it, Lindsay.
Hi, Lindsay Schlickaway from NB Energy. Yes, this one for us is something that we wanted added. And basically, we were looking for the lost opportunity cost calculator for use limited resources to include the use of the resource by the BA, so that the market, when it calculates the actual lost opportunity cost, it's not calculating that full limitation of just what the market would use. It should take off a little bit for the reliability use, because there's actually other uses that we have to use it for. So we would like that to be captured in that lost opportunity cost. That's to provide a little bit more context.
No, I appreciate that, Lindsay. Thank you. Are there any other BAAs that have resources that are in similar positions or agree that they would also like to see changes to that lost opportunity calculator? Not seeing any hands. I'm assuming there's got to be some other resources out there. And Lindsay, if you wouldn't mind, maybe, you know, the importance of, and maybe, you know, I understand, you know, all BAAs have different tools in their tool bags to maintain that reliability. You know, could you help, you know, kind of contextualize for this audience what that means exactly for this particular, you know, set of resources within that BAA? You know, the importance of having it there, and, you know, to the extent those costs aren't reflected, what that means for overall participation. I see Lindsay's hand back up. Thank you, Lindsay. I appreciate it.
Hi, yes, okay. Yes, so for, I guess, anybody who isn't aware, so the use limited resource, it's a type of resource that you can register in the CAISO, and it allows you to incorporate an opportunity cost into your into that use limitation of the resource. So it's either starts or run hour limited, usually by an environmental permit, or I think there's other qualifiers as well to qualify for this use limitation. But it adds adds an adder into your cost. And currently, right now, that as long as it can be modeled through CAISO, they will calculate that opportunity cost for that adder. And they basically use their, I guess it's I'm not as familiar with how it's done, but it's I guess modeled in their software. They can model the amount of the resource is limited. Let's say it has, I don't know, 100 run hours that it's limited to. They will model that, and then they will tell you what your adder is for, say, your mid-load. And what we're requesting is that they also include the resources used for, if it's relied on heavily for ancillary services. If say we use, say, I don't know, for if it has 100 run hours for the year, then we use 50 run hours, then we would like it to subtract out what we typically use historically for that reliability need, so that it could actually populate the true amount of the true cost of what it would be available to the market, so that it doesn't just run all of the total limitation in that modeling to determine that cost. And so that's really what we're asking for. And hopefully.
Okay, that's kind of, no, I appreciate that. That's kind of to help ensure the market accounts for that reliability need and reflects those costs accordingly. I hear you. And I think, you know, when we talk about in any working group, reliability comes first, right? So, you know, I absolutely look forward to, and I would encourage stakeholders to think about this a little bit more and provide feedback on this specific item here. So thank you, Lindsay. All right, let me touch, and I think this, you know, I was circling back to, I think, something you mentioned, Darren, earlier, or it might have been Joe at SRP, but gas system limitations, right? So that was kind of the fifth main challenge we've heard, or that's kind of been discussed, at least brought up during these forums. And this one was gas burn limitations not taken into account when ordered, right? So to the extent there's a minimum burn limitation or a maximum burn limitation, what we've heard was entities are looking for the ability for the BAA to set those burn limitations on specific gas lines, right? So it's something that the optimization consumes and would, you know, kind of honor those constraints when feeding the market. Again, kind of, as I mentioned earlier, testing those associated principles that we talked about, you know, feasibility, things like that. Obviously, it's feasible because, as many of you know, the CAISO system does have gas nomograms. There was filings made at FERC a while back, and I would like to ask the community, you know, in this particular instance, you know, what type of qualifiers would there have to be in place for an entity to potentially utilize those limitations, right? Again, these limitations are reliability level, not economic. Stuart from LA.
Yeah, Mark, in this particular one, I was kind of thinking that you know, CAISO would, you know, take OFOs or whatever, and you know, that would drive the nomogram kind of limits. It wasn't so much the BAA necessarily submitting those, but it's directly coming from the, you know, pipeline information, and probably not dissimilar to what CAISO's doing itself. So that you're not trying to push against an OFO where, you know, it's limiting gas burn. Does that make sense?
Got it. Yeah, so you're saying CAISO utilized that as an input into the market optimization itself, not necessarily for a BAA to set those limitations at the nomogram level for a set of resources, right, to kind of help maintain that separate entity.
Yeah, I think that would be important. Otherwise, it might be problematic. I think, you know, taking what currently exists for CAISO and expanding it to different areas. And it'd be interesting what Darn. I remember Darn bringing this one up, you know, maybe a year ago. They have unique challenges with their pipeline, so I don't know how that would work with their pipeline. But that was the idea behind it, is, you know, taking the gas pipeline information to, you know, form the nomograms or trigger whatever is in the nomogram and use that in the optimization.
Gotcha. No, that's good, and I think that's the first way I've heard it spun that way on this forum, Stuart. So I appreciate you laying it out that way, because when I first read this, that was kind of some of my reaction as well, was, you know, providing an entity to do that, and obviously that drives market results. But if we're talking about utilizing the information from the gas system itself into them as feeders into that market, then I think that's a different story. So appreciate you bringing that up. Is there any other comments on this last particular item before I officially turn it over to Katie? Sorry, Katie. And again, if we don't get through your slides, Katie, you know, the last slide here of kind of next steps, I'm going to kind of get a feel from the audience. I think we're finally getting some really good momentum in these conversations, and I definitely want to keep that going. So, you know, I was going to try to see what the appetite was for potentially having another one of these calls by the end of September. So, you know, maybe not next week, but the week after, to allow time for that discussion paper to get posted, comments and all that fun stuff, and then go from there. All right, not seeing any other comments. So Katie, or Isabella first, let's go to the next slide. All right, so real quick on data analysis needs, what we've heard to date so far, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. No need to comment here. We will, obviously continue taking in some data analysis needs feedback that will help inform that straw proposal, is identifying the outstanding CCW enhancements yet to be delivered, see how those fold into these discussions, forecast accuracy numbers and the D2 plus D+1 for both load and variable energy resources, and then an aggregate representation of how often the current caps get utilized. Again, going back to earlier discussion around, the OFOs back then and the amount of volatility back then aren't reflective of today's conditions. Next slide, please. All right, Katie, without further ado, I want to kind of introduce Katie Wickler. She is the expert as it pertains to all this fun gas resource management stuff that we do today. So if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, Katie, and diving in, I appreciate it.
Thanks, Mark. Just confirming you can hear me okay?
Yep, go ahead.
Excellent. Good morning, everybody. This is Katie Wickler. I'm a senior market engineering specialist here at the CAISO. Thanks for all the good discussion so far this morning. Just wanted to spend a little bit of time in this forum talking through some of the functionality that we've been discussing as a group, just to sort of level set and give, sort of a baseline understanding of all these different concepts and components. So I'll try and go through these somewhat quickly. I don't want to rush too much, but there is some information I may be able to sort of gloss through and leave to you to peruse on your own time. So let's just jump right in. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go over some topics, including fuel regions, how those are formulated and calculated. We'll talk through DEBs and commitment costs. We'll also go through the reference level change request process, both the automated and the manual that we've been discussing, and then briefly talk about use limitations and opportunity costs at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So before I dive into those topics, I just wanted to give sort of a brief reminder of what the bidding structure looks like for generators. So with this three-part bid that generators submit to Cyber, which is our bidding platform, that will include the startup cost bid and the min load cost bid. Collectively, we refer to those as the commitment cost bids. And of course, if you are bidding for a multi-stage generating resource, you would also submit transition cost bids as well, the cost to transition between those different MSG configurations. So those are collectively considered the commitment costs. And then you'd also submit that energy bid, the cost to sort of move incrementally between PMIN and PMAX. So the commitment costs are, as we've sort of been discussing, those are limited by what we informally refer to as the commitment cost bid caps. And I'll get into a little bit more about the logic and the formulation of those. Energy bids, a little bit different framework. So the energy bids can be submitted between the bid floor and the bid cap. I'll talk a little bit about the bid cap. And so, between that range, they may be mitigated to either the default energy bid or the competitive LMP if market power is detected. So somewhat of a different paradigm than the bidding of commitment costs. So just wanted to clarify that before we jumped in. Next slide, please. All right, let's go to fuel regions. And the way I've sort of structured this here is, we're going to talk about some of the inputs into the formulations. We'll talk about the formulations, and then we'll talk about some of these additional processes that we use. So starting with the fuel region prices, or the natural gas prices that we use in our markets, we source and calculate natural gas prices daily for each market, and we use external vendor data. So that looks a little bit different between markets here. So for the day-ahead market, we will take the price that's trading on the WebICE trading platform from the Intercontinental Exchange, and we will source that price between approximately 8 and 9 a.m. Pacific time. Once that price is sourced, it goes downstream into our calculations. It's used in the calculations of day-ahead DEBs and commitment costs, and then those flow into the day-ahead market processes. We don't post that price externally due to data sensitivity concerns, so that price isn't something that we post externally for the day ahead. On the other hand, for the real time, we use a settled index price of between 1 to 3 vendors' prices. So if we have more than one, we'll basically just take the simple average of those indexes' weighted average prices, and we'll calculate that around 10 p.m. Pacific. So we'll be grabbing those prices once they've settled and concluded trading for the next day. The real-time price we do post to Oasis for each individual fuel region. I will note that the price that is posted to Oasis includes the gas price as well as the transportation cost. So when you're seeing that report on Oasis, please keep in mind that that's the summation of those two components, which I'll discuss in my next slide. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, thank you. So each resource in their master file parameters will be mapped to a specific fuel region, and that's tied at the resource ID level. So there is that mapping. Any sort of changes to the fuel region, because that is a typical master file parameter, will follow the standard master file update process, so typically taking between 7 to 10 business days to make that update. Scheduling coordinators do have the option to use any of the established fuel regions within their BAA if they are applicable to their specific resource, or they have the option to create their own custom fuel region. And so that would be initiated through a request to our team, and you would be able to work with us and set up something that's a little bit more customized to specific transportation costs that you may be facing for the resource. I will note that the election of the fuel region mapping is something that the SCs need to, the scheduling coordinators need to do actively. Otherwise, we'll just assign what we call the default or the generic fuel region to the resource. That's calculated as the minimum of all fuel regions within the BAA for each day. So that is an active election that the scheduling coordinators need to select there. We have, I think we're up to about 170 custom fuel regions so far. The link I provided will show you an overview of all of those custom fuel regions for each BAA, all the different components that are folded into those, if you're curious. So let's go to the next slide. Great, thank you. So we spoke about the fuel region price, the natural gas hub price. That's updated daily per market. To get to the final fuel region price, we'll take that, and we'll also take the transportation cost. That's something that incorporates any sort of marginal transportation rates between, the pipeline to the resource, any other fuel reimbursement rates, taxes, other miscellaneous costs, and we'll add that as well. The transportation cost is updated somewhat less frequently. We do have a process to update those rates monthly. We'll take a look at all the different tariffs and make those updates in our system. The fuel region price, as I'm sure you're aware at this point, is very important. It's used in the calculation of DEBs and commitment costs, so it is a pretty crucial input to those calculations. As we've been discussing, currently fuel regions can only utilize one gas pricing hub. We don't have the ability right now to reflect multiple, pricing hubs as we've been discussing. If we go to the next slide, maybe a numerical example will be helpful. So here's just a quick example. Say we have a fuel region that's defined using the El Paso South Main Line hub as its gas transportation hub, or excuse me, its gas commodity hub, and we have an established transportation cost as well. So we'll basically just add those two components together. 309 and 174 will get added for a total fuel region price of $4.83 an MMBTU. That's what gets fed into those calculations of the DEBs and commitment costs further downstream. And before I move on to the next topic, I'll just pause briefly to see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Katie. Good information here. All right, I see Darren at Idaho with his hand up. Oh, looks like his hand went down. Oh, back up. Adrian, do you mind unmuting Darren's line? Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for the question, Katie. So just want to step back real quick. I think in the previous slide, you said if a fuel region was not assigned to a specific unit, you would take the lowest fuel price within the region and assign it?
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, if we go back one more slide.
Oh, was it two back? Okay.
Yeah, it looks like, yeah.
Okay, so that's the mapping of that generic region to the extent one is assigned.
And that's is that done daily, or is that done just?
Yeah, the calculation of what we call the default or the generic region is done daily per market. So, you know, you can think of the generic region as sort of an umbrella, and underneath that are all of the other custom fuel regions within that specific BAA. Those are getting calculated daily per market. And so when those are calculated, we'll basically take the min of all of those, and that's what sets that default or generic region per day per market.
Okay, thanks. Good to know. My thought was on the other potential solution of trying to pick multiple fuel regions or zones or a generator within a BA, it could be used the other way if you were trying to, you know what I mean, make sure cost recovery and scheduling coordinators were getting rewarded what they had to actually pay. So anyways, I was just thinking, I thought I heard that right. I wanted to make sure, so I appreciate the clarification.
No, thank you for the question.
And thanks, Mark.
All right, not seeing any other hands, Katie, if you wanted to continue on to the next set of Debs.
Sure, yeah, let's go to the next slide. So wanted to cover default energy bids. And here, you know, just sort of a high level overview of the different calculation options that we offer. And as I mentioned, you know, the Debs come into play on a resource specific basis when market power mitigation is triggered, and there is the potential for that resource to be mitigated to either the DEB or the competitive LNP. We do offer some different options for calculating the DEBs. I won't really go into detail on some of these. The one I wanted to cover is the variable cost-based DEB. That's typically the more common DEB option for gas resources, but of course we have lots of details about these options in the BPMs if you're curious. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this is just more of a reference slide to show you what the cost-based DEB calculation looks like for a gas unit. Mostly just wanted to point out here, you can see where that fuel price comes into play in the calculation. That's that fuel region price, again, the commodity hub price plus the transportation cost. That's getting fed into the calculation there. And then you're seeing that 1.1 or 110% scalar applied to the calculated parameter. So just a bit of reference on how the calculation works there. Let's go to the next slide, please. So just a quick note on energy bid caps. So FERC Order 831 specified that, you know, in our markets, what we consider the soft energy bid cap is set at $1,000. In order for generators to submit energy bids above that soft cap, they need to follow a cost verification process. And so if the cost verification process is followed and supported, generators may be able to bid above $1,000 up to the $2,000 hard energy bid cap. And just a note with the cost verification logic, the reference level change request process is sort of our mechanism for cost verification for bids above $1,000. I didn't want to go too much into detail here. There is plenty of details in the BPM if you're curious on how that works. But just to sort of mention that, you know, the reference level change request process does get used in this context as well in terms of bidding above the soft energy bid cap. Any questions on DEBs before I move into commitment costs?
All right, hands from the audience, not seeing any. All right, let's keep rolling, Katie.
All right, great. So two options that we provide for calculating, for our calculations of the commitment costs. We have the proxy cost option that's available to all generators. typically the more commonly utilized calculation option. And then we do have the registered cost option. That's a little bit more, some more parameters in terms of being able to take advantage of that option. I'm going to focus on the proxy cost methodology in my discussion here. But if we move to the next slide, again, a bit of a reference slide here for you. Not going to go into details on this, but just wanted to show you what the proxy minimum load cost calculation looks like for a gas unit. Again, showing where that gas price is sort of fed into the calculations. You'll notice there isn't that 25% adder here. I'm going to talk about that in just a second and how that sort of plays out. But just a reference slide for you. And the next slide just shows the startup cost calculation. Again, highlighting where that startup or the fuel cost is incorporated. So we go to the next slide. Yeah, just showing the same thing. So I'll leave that for you all to take a look at after this presentation. But if we go to the next slide, I wanted to just clarify some of the language about defaults and caps and things like that. So we've sort of been referring to the amount at which scheduling coordinators can submit their min load and startup cost bids as the caps. We refer to these more formally as the default commitment cost value. And what the default commitment cost value ends up being is 125% of the proxy cost value, those formulas that I just showed you, plus any applicable opportunity cost adder. If the resource is use limited and is eligible to receive an opportunity cost adder, they may have that applied to their default value as well. So that 125 gets applied to the proxy calculation. We add on the opportunity cost. So that's just a bit of a clarification about some of the terminology we've been using. Our intent with the 25% multiplier is really to account for fuel price variations and other costs that might be incidental or hard to quantify, hard for us to capture in a pre-market calculation to sort of represent those costs that may not be reflected or up to date in the proxy calculation. I think that's what I have for commitment costs. So let me just pause and see if there's any questions there.
Thank you, Katie. Any questions from the audience on commitment costs and how those are calculated? I know the fun stuff is next. That's where we get into some of the automated manual reference level adjustments and things like that. Not seeing any hands.
All right, either I'm covering everything or everyone's excited for lunch. So let's move on here to reference level change requests. Next slide, please. So, as I've sort of covered the concept of DEBs and commitment costs, we refer to these in a grouping as reference levels. So we calculate these reference levels, as we've discussed, using gas prices and various resource parameters like heat rate, et cetera. The intent behind introducing the reference level change request processes were, to the extent that scheduling coordinators who may have fuel costs that are higher than what we use in those calculations, we established these processes to give them an opportunity to request a higher cost to be used in our calculation of the reference levels. And so that's what we mean by the reference level change request process. It's sort of an avenue for scheduling coordinators to be able to request higher fuel costs to be used in those calculations. If we approve the reference level change request, we will recalculate the reference levels prior to the market close, and those will be a bit more up to date and reflected in what the market optimization eventually uses. We have two sort of flavors of the reference level change request process, either manual or automated. Those are two separate sort of processes, and I will go into them now. We could go to the next slide. All right, so let's start with the manual process, and Mark sort of discussed this previously, but just to give you an idea of what that process looks like. So what we require is for the scheduling coordinator to submit a ticket to us via Citi, our Citi platform, with the requested fuel cost that they want to use in that adjustment, as well as supporting documentation. That's a very important piece of the submission. And that needs to be submitted by 8 a.m. Pacific on the day that the market is executed. So for example, for the day ahead, if you wanted to submit a manual request for day ahead 9/19, that would have had to be in by 8 a.m. this morning. If you wanted to submit a manual request for real time, say today, 9/18, that would also need to be in by 8 a.m. Pacific. You know, the caveat with real time there is that there are some hours in the morning that would be missed that could be made up with using the automated process. But again, this is a manual process. It comes to my team. We review these requests and process them in a pretty tight window in the morning. So the price in that manual request needs to be at least 10% or 50 cents, that should say, or 50 cents greater than what we use in our calculations of the reference levels. So we'll take a look at that. We'll take a look at the supporting documentation, the other sort of criteria that needs to be met. And if we approve the ticket, we'll send that cost down to our systems and we'll recalculate the DEBs and the default commitment cost caps with that approved fuel price. And we'll let you know in that city ticket sort of the determination of the review. A note about the cutoff time, and I know we've sort of discussed that previously in this call. The 8 a.m. cutoff time is sort of, you know, it's necessary for our team to have enough time to review the ticket, sort of to do our manual review, and to give our systems enough time to sort of recalculate those values and have them flow downstream with enough time for you to see them on your side and react to them before the market closes. So, you know, for day ahead, of course, we're working with sort of a tighter timeline due to a variety of sort of constraints there. But let me pause. I know that was a lot of information, so let me just pause and see if there's any comments about that process.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. And I think this is kind of where we had quite a bit of conversation earlier. I see Michelle from LA with her hand up. Go ahead, Michelle.
So I do have a question regarding the, I guess, staffing resources for CAISO on being able to review this request on a timely manner, right? I know when LA joined EIN, we had a staff of people to make sure that we had all hands on deck, especially for real time. Is there any plans on either automating this service or having more staffing on CAISO's end so that they could review this request? Because especially in EIM, as these requests are coming in real time, that could essentially change the calculations if they get approved.
Right. No, I think that's a good point, Michelle. And Katie, I hope you don't mind me jumping in here. I think that's something that we can, you know, absolutely take a step back, you know, as you talk about more WEIN participants potentially needing to utilize this process, and kind of going back to our earlier conversation where, you know, it would be great if this process wasn't necessarily needed at all, meaning it's getting covered in an automated fashion to where there isn't necessarily someone sitting there happening to kind of manually walk through each one of these requests. So I think your point's well taken, and that's something we can absolutely take back and discuss, you know, as whatever the outcome is, again, testing that principle of feasibility to determine what the next best steps are. So I appreciate that. Any other questions for Katie on this slide from the community? All right, let's go to the next slide here, Katie, and then I think after this slide, we could jump to kind of the next steps slide, and then we'll give opportunity for stakeholders to kind of review I know you have a few slides on the opportunity costs and things like that. They can kind of maybe review that offline, you know, in the interest of time, and then, you know, provide comments and things like that through the discussion paper comments.
Sure, sounds good. All right, so let's wrap up here with just a quick recap of the automated reference level change request process. So we've discussed the manual, let's cover the automated. This, you know, we sort of call it automated because it doesn't require sort of a pre-market manual review on our team's end. So what this looks like is the scheduling coordinators submitting their adjustments to their DEBs and commitment cost caps directly in Cyber in the bidding platform. You know, one caveat here is we expect, because you have a better understanding of what your actual or expected fuel cost is in those calculations, that those adjustments would not include those extra headrooms of 25% or 10% on the commitment costs and DEBs. So that's something that you submit directly in Cyber. What we do for those adjustments is cap them at something we call the reasonableness threshold. This is something I think Mark had mentioned previously as well, a resource-specific calculated parameter that adds sort of an incremental margin on top of the fuel costs that we use. So it gives you some extra room to make that adjustment to that DEB and commitment cost directly in the software. And, so you'll submit that. We'll accept those adjustments up to that reasonableness threshold. Anything above that will get capped at that value. And you may be eligible for aftermarket cost recovery for costs that were capped at that threshold value. We do ask for the automated process, we do require that you retain supporting documentation. So even though we're not involved in approving the adjustment, we do expect that you retain that supporting documentation to justify that adjustment, that cost adjustment, because we do have the ability to audit those requests. And so if you are audited and you cannot properly justify the adjustment, there may be some temporary ineligibility to submit those adjustments. So just sort of an important audit piece there for that process. Questions about that?
Yeah, Katie, I have one, and I don't mean to put you on the spot. Help me connect. So for the automated reference level change request process, it makes sense for an entity, again, with those reasonableness thresholds that are in place to reflect a more accurate gas cost or fuel cost for their associated unit. Is it fair to say that the manual reference level change request process would only, in normal practice, would only be utilized to the extent this automated reference level change request process didn't, their change request was above that threshold?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, in general, both processes are available to the scheduling coordinators if they meet the criteria. But, I think in general, the idea behind the manual request is to reflect any sort of larger deltas between the fuel costs we're using and the fuel costs that the resource is facing beyond what may be able to be covered in the automated request. So, just sort of generally teasing that out there. Yeah.
Got it. No, I appreciate that. All right. Any other questions on this slide before we jump to next steps? And then I do see a question in the chat. Katie, which do you have off the top of your head? If not, we could follow up. But do you know which section of the BPM covers the reasonableness thresholds?
Yes, that would be the BPM for market instruments, attachment O. I think I had that in a later slide. And I'll just say briefly that the BPMs have really extensive detail on all of these processes. We've tried to add as much information there as we can to sort of help you understand the process and provide those details. So I'd really recommend the BPMs as a good reference source. But attachment O will contain the details about the reasonableness threshold calculations.
Got it. Thank you, Katie. All right, I'm not seeing any other hands. So Isabella, in the interest of time, do you mind jumping to that last slide real quick? All right, so we will be posting a discussion paper on this. I'll be looking to get that out as soon as possible. Again, I think based on these conversations and based on the feedback of that discussion paper, maybe try to get another working group meeting scheduled by the end of September. Hopefully, real quick by show of hands, to the extent you guys are in favor of that, just raise your hand, put them back down. I think we have some good momentum here. And then the second thing there is a survey. So I mentioned earlier, it'd be a good idea to get an idea of, based on, get a sense of how much gas is getting procured in that day ahead cycle versus real time. I heard, Platts may be a tool to utilize to see if we can get a general sense of that number, but it might also be good to kind of survey that. That way it's anonymous and, we protect everyone's practices and things like that. But to the extent you believe there's some other good survey questions that we should be asking, that's going to be something that we will kind of pose in the discussion paper, and look forward to your comments on that. That way we can get those questions incorporated as well in that survey, and then maybe review those results in this next upcoming working group. All right, I really appreciate the engagement today. I think everything we discussed, it sounds like we're moving along on identifying what those problem statements really are. I look forward to going back and listening to this recording and refining those problem statements with the ISO policy team, and definitely look forward to everyone's feedback on that discussion paper. With that, have a great lunch and enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you.
Thank you, and that concludes our conference. You may now disconnect.